In this video, we're going to work with a zigzag border, and this is something that's utilized with doing tackle twill. And instead of having a border that's like a satin stitch, it uses a lighter zigzag stitch, and basically the point of it is to keep it really light so there's not a lot of stitches, and it allows the fabric to be the star, not a border. So all the emphasis ends up going onto the applique fabric itself instead of the border. And so it's a little bit different, but it's very similar as well. And in the previous two videos, I've shown you how I've just kind of digitized around a shape using a run stitch tool or applique tool. In this video, I already have a piece of artwork here. In the Floriani software, I can just convert this artwork to a stitch. And so instead of going through that again, you can watch the previous videos on how that's done to create that stitch or the artwork. I'm just going to go ahead and take this piece here and I'm going to convert it to a stitch. So I'm going to convert that to a running stitch so that now I have a placement line, because that's one of the first things that you need is a placement stitch. And if I put in 3D view, you can see that stitch here. So with tackle twill, most of the time it's always being done pre-cut. It's kind of a stiffer fabric. It's not one that you would want to like lay down an entire piece and then do a tackdown stitch and try to cut around the edge. It just wouldn't work all that well, especially in a design like this where you're having to get into little tighter areas. So with tackle twill itself, you can do it with regular fabric, but if you're using that polyester material, you definitely want to pre-cut it first. You'd want to work with a fabric cutter in order to get that fabric prepped before you put it on. I just wanted to point that out. Now you can use this technique with regular fabric, that you could do a tack down and then a border, and that's fine too. It's just if you're using that material, you want to keep that in mind, the tackle twill material. So now I have a placement stitch here, so I need to create the tack down stitch. So I'm just going to copy it and paste it so that now I have a duplicate, and I'm going to change the color. And so with tackle twill, you because it's using this zigzag stitch and the fabric is supposed to be kind of like the star of the show, the color of the thread you'll use for the zigzag border is usually the same color as the material itself. It doesn't have to be, but the majority of the time that's what you're going to see. It's going to utilize the same color of thread as the tackle twill material, and I just want to point that out. So now that I have a running stitch here, I need to turn this into a zigzag stitch. So the first thing I need to do is convert it to like a satin stitch, and we utilize a steel satin in the Floriani software, and basically what that is it utilizes the same width throughout the entire satin stitch. So you can take any kind of a run stitch and convert it right over to a steel stitch, and it's just going to follow that same path, creating this satin stitch here. Now, one of the things that you definitely would do is make sure you have your width correct. So I'm going to change this, and with this type of a process for working with tackle twill, you're not going to use quite as wide of a border as you would if you were using a satin. So I'm going to go up to a 3 instead of a 4 like I've used in the previous videos. This is about as far as I want to go for width. And the next thing I need to do is change the density, because right now it's a satin stitch border. So I'm going to need to lighten the density quite a bit so that it looks like a zigzag stitch, because there isn't like a zigzag stitch in the software. It's basically the steel satin with a lighter density. So I'm going to change this to a 2 millimeter density, which is much lighter than a 0.4 or 0.5, and you can see that that really lightens it up quite a bit. And now you can kind of see fabric through. So there's a lot less stitches. If I go back, I'm at 3,119 stitches, but when I change that density, I'm now at 1,004. So it cut down 2,000 stitches just by making this much lighter. And just wanted to point that out. The next thing that I do is I work with the connection end. So instead of being sharp, which a sharp goes when it's doing the embroidery, it does a stitch up and then comes over, up, over. Whereas zigzag goes kind of halfway between, making a zigzag stitch. So if I come over here to the connection end and I change it, it's going to make sure that it's utilizing, a zigzag as opposed to a sharp edge. So this is basically what you need in order to do tackle twill. You're working with a open satin stitch or zigzag here, and you have your placement stitch. Now, you can use this stitch, this zigzag, as the tack down and border. You don't need to have an additional stitch to tack it down first. You can just go right with this zigzag. The only thing that I say is that if you're going to do that with a pre-cut, I would use something like an Applique Wonder, Floriani Applique Wonder, where you put that onto the back of the fabric first, and it fuses to it, and then the back side of it has a release paper, and it makes it sticky. So it will actually hold it in place really well. If you don't have anything to hold that fabric down, it's going to be really difficult to do anything that's pre-cut, and most of the time you have to use something like that anyway. To run it through a cutter, it has to have some kind of a backing to the fabric, so something like an Applique Wonder works great for that. And there's lots of different variations of that. So if you are wanting to look for something like that, you can go to R&K Distributing website, and you can look up Applique Wonder from Floriani, and you can figure out kind of what's similar in other products if that's what you need to do. So in this zigzag, the only things that I change is that because it's pre-cut, I don't need to have it go so far off the fabric. Okay, so this is something that we talked about in the first video of offsetting. And so if I go to my steel stitch and I select it, you can see that it's right now the inset over here in the properties is set at 50, meaning it's basically 50% on both sides of this line, right? The middle is down the center, the stitches are based off of that center point. So if I want the fabric to be more, or the stitches to be more on the fabric, I can change the inset. So if I change the inset to 75, now it's going to be 75% on the fabric, 25% off the fabric. This is what I typically use. Some people will go down to 70 so that there's a little bit more room on the edge. But if you're working with a pre-cut fabric that has a sticky back to it, or you use some spray adhesive or whatever you choose to do, it's going to hold it in place really well, and you're going to have enough room that you can typically get away with a 75 and get these stitches a little bit closer to the edge. And basically that is the only other adjustment you would need to make, and is just the offset. But that's a tackle twill. That's how tackle twill works. I'm going to go put this back to a 50. Sometimes you have to play with the stitches to make sure that they all come out just right, but with other settings, you definitely don't want any underlay attached to that zigzag stitch. But that is how you would set up and do tackle twill. Or you can use regular fabric, and it just allows the applique fabric to kind of be the star of the show, right? So you would use the same color, and it would allow it to really shine, the applique fabric. You can change the color too. There's nothing wrong with that, and it will give it a different look. So the choice is yours, but that's typically what's done with tackle twill, and it's pretty easy to set up. Your tack down and your border are kind of the same stitch, just like with raw edge. You don't have 3 pieces, you only have 2 pieces, a placement and a tack down border. So in the next video, we're gonna look at utilizing kind of a more decorative stitch. So instead of a satin stitch or a raw edge or the zigzag, we're gonna do a motif border. So the motif border will become the kind of decorative stitch that locks that applique fabric down. So we'll see you in the next video.